The Yard of Fear. The steel gate slams shut with sound that echoes through your bones. You're standing in the yard of Rikers Island Supermax, surrounded by hundreds of men. At first glance, it looks like the guards are watching from towers above. But look closer. Their eyes are cold, distant, and their hands rest on their belts, not to protect, but to wait. Because here, inside the most feared blocks of Rikers, it's not the officers who keep order, it's the gangs. Imagine a young inmate, barely 18, stepping into this yard for the first time. He doesn't belong to anyone. No crew, no protection. He thinks the guards will keep him safe. But in seconds, a group of tattooed men circle him like wolves. One of them whispers in his ear, "You don't run with us. You don't run at all." The boy's eyes dart toward the guards behind the glass. They don't move. They don't step in. Because inside these walls, survival is not about the law. It's about power. That night, the boy is forced to make a choice, bend the will of the gang, or risk being crushed under it. And as his fate hangs in the balance, the truth of Rikers Island Supermax becomes clear. This is a jail where gangs make the rules. But how did this place, meant to control chaos, turn to a world where gangs decide who lives, who eats, and who bleeds? The island of no escape. To understand Rikers Island Supermax, you have to first understand Rikers itself, a small spit of land in New York's East River, wedged between Queens and the Bronx. To outsiders, it's just another jail. But to anyone who's been inside, Rikers isn't just a facility. It's a world of its own. Picture this: 10 separate jails packed onto one island. Razor wire coils stretch as far as the eye can see. Buses rumble over the bridge day and night, ferrying new arrivals into what many call hell's waiting room. Because once you're sent here, you don't just lose your freedom. You step into a dangerous ecosystem where every choice could be your last. In the Supermax units, the stakes are even higher. These blocks are meant for the worst of the worst, men considered too violent or disruptive for general population. But instead of control, what you find is something else entirely: the birth of an underground society run by gangs. For a new inmate, the lesson comes quick. On day one, the veterans size you up. They know if you're weak. They know if you're scared. They know if you don't have anyone backing you up. And in here, being alone is the same as being marked. So the choice is simple: pick a side or be swallowed whole. Bloods, Crips, Latin Kings, Trinitarios, each one carves out its own territory inside these walls. They control phones, food, showers, even the flow of contraband. To the outside world, it's shocking. But inside, it's normal. It's survival. Some inmates join gangs out of loyalty because they grew up with those same crews in the streets of Brooklyn, the Bronx, or Harlem. Others join out of fear because without protection, they won't last a week. Once you take that step, though, there's no going back. Leaving a gang in Rikers is like signing your own death certificate. The officers, they know this. They've seen it play out countless times, and many have quietly accepted it. Why? Because gangs, in their own twisted way, keep order. If you remove their influence, chaos explodes. So, the guards watch. They let gangs handle their business. And only when blood spills too far, only when violence gets too loud, do they step in. It's a system built on silence, on unspoken agreements, on fear. And yet, for those trapped inside, Rikers Island Supermax is more than a jail. It's a kingdom where law doesn't belong to the state. It belongs to the gangs. But what happens when the balance tips too far? What happens when the gang's grip on power becomes stronger than the jail itself? That's where the Riot story begins. The silent deal. Inside Rikers Supermax, there's a truth most officers will never admit out loud. Gangs keep the blocks running. On paper, it's the Department of Correction that sets the rules. But on the tiers, inside the day rooms and out in the yards, the real authority rests in the hands of gang leaders. Take Housing Unit 4C, one of the most infamous blocks. To an outsider, it looks like a maze of steel doors and narrow hallways. But to those who live there, it's a kingdom divided into invisible borders. One corner might belong to the Bloods, another to the Trinitarios. The Crips claim the phones near the back, while the Latin Kings control the showers. The guards know this. They see it every day. And most of the time, they let it slide. Why? Because in a twisted way, the gangs provide stability. If officers push too hard, if they strip gangs of their influence, riots erupt, blood spills, order collapses. So instead, many guards make an unspoken deal. They allow gangs to govern themselves as long as they keep the peace. But peace is a fragile word inside these walls. One story often whispered among inmates is about a correction officer who tried to shut down the gang system. He cracked down on phone time, took away contraband, and rotated cell assignments to break up gang cliques. For a few days, the block was silent, but then the violence returned with a fury. Inmates smashed light fixtures, set small fires, and one morning, a shank was found taped under a table in the officer's unit. It was a warning. The officer requested a transfer within a week. Most guards learned the same lesson. Survival doesn't just apply to inmates. Even officers have to adapt to the invisible law of the gangs. And yet the silent deal isn't always balanced. Because when one gang grows too powerful, the entire block feels it. Food trays are handed out to favorites first. New arrivals are pressured to check in or face punishment. Even who sleeps on which bunk can be dictated by gang rank. To outsiders, it might sound impossible, but inside Rikers Supermax, it's simply how life works. And for the inmates caught in the middle, that silent deal is both a shield and a trap. But if the gangs control food, beds, and territory, what about communication with the outside world? That's where the real battles begin. The phone wars. If there's one thing more valuable than food inside Rikers Supermax, it's the phones. The phones aren't just a way to call home. They're lifelines. They connect inmates to their families, their lawyers, and their crews on the outside. In a place where freedom is stripped away, 10 minutes on a phone can feel like oxygen. But in Supermax, those phones don't belong to the Department of Correction. They belong to the gangs. Picture a row of phones bolted to the wall. On paper, any inmate can line up and make a call. In reality, every phone is claimed. One gang has the first two. Another controls the third. And the last? Usually reserved for whoever has enough muscle to hold it. The rule is simple. If you're not with a crew that owns a phone, you don't touch it. There's one story that's been told again and again about a young inmate who broke that rule. He was desperate to call his daughter on her birthday. The gang that controlled the phones had already set their schedule. Their members first, everyone else after. But the young man couldn't wait. He picked up the receiver anyway. What happened next was quick, brutal, and silent from the guards. Within seconds, he was dragged away from a phone. Fists flew. His face slammed into concrete. By the time officers noticed, it was too late. He lay on the floor, bruised and broken. The incident was logged as just another inmate conflict. The gangs walked away untouched. The phone went back to its rightful owner. And this wasn't a one-time story. These phone wars happen again and again. Sometimes it's about access. Sometimes it's about debt. If you borrow time on another gang's phone, you owe them. That debt can be paid in favors, loyalty, or sometimes blood. For the families on the outside, they'll never know the full truth. They'll just hear a loved one's voice cutting in and out, desperate to stay connected before the line goes dead. But for inmates on the inside, the phone isn't just about love. It's about survival. Because controlling the phones means controlling information. And in a place like Rikers Supermax, information is power. But phones are just one piece of the puzzle. Because beyond communication, gangs have built their own systems of justice. Systems that rival, and sometimes overshadow, the prison itself, the rules within the rules. Inside Rikers Supermax, there's the official rule book. No fighting, no contraband, follow orders. And then there's the real rule book, the one written not by the Department of Correction, but by the gangs. These rules are invisible to outsiders, but every inmate knows them. Break them, and you pay the price. Follow them, and maybe you'll survive. The gang's rules cover everything. Who eats first? Who showers when? Who can sit in the day room? Who has to clean the floors? Even how loud you can talk at night. To someone on the outside, it might seem strange that inmates would follow orders from other inmates. But inside, Those rules carry more weight than anything the officers say. Why? Because the punishment for breaking the gang's rules is swift and unavoidable. Guards might hand out a write-up or maybe a few days in solitary. But if you cross a gang rule, the punishment comes from your peers. And in a block where the guards look the other way, that punishment can be far more terrifying. There's a chilling story about one inmate who refused to give up his food tray to a higher-ranking member of the block. In the official rule book, he was in the right. Food is supposed to be distributed equally. But in the real rule book, he was wrong. That night, his cell door malfunctioned. Within minutes, other inmates slipped inside. When the lights came on in the morning, he was battered and barely conscious. Officers called it an altercation. The inmates called it justice. And yet, the gang system of justice isn't always about violence. Sometimes it's about control. If two inmates have a dispute, it's not the guards who settle it. It's the gang leaders. They'll decide who's right, who's wrong, and what punishment is fair. In their twisted way, they keep the block from tearing itself apart. It's a fragile balance. And sometimes that balance tips. Because when one inmate dares to defy the rules, when someone challenges the invisible law of the gangs, the block becomes a powder keg. The air shifts. The guards feel it. The inmates feel it. Everyone knows something is about to break. And when it does, it doesn't just affect one man. It shakes the entire block. So what happens when that fragile balance is shattered? That's the story we'll unravel next. The collapse of control. There's a saying whispered on Rikers Island. The guards have the keys, but the gangs have the power. And nowhere is that more obvious than when the fragile balance breaks. One night in the Supermax blocks, tensions boiled over. A dispute had been building for days between two rival crews, the Bloods and the Trinitarios. It started small, an argument over food trays, a few threats near the showers, some icy stares across the day room. But in a place like Rikers, small things don't stay small. They spread like fire. The guards notice the signs. Inmates moving in groups, coded handshakes exchanged more often, whispered conversations that fell silent when officers walked by. But instead of intervening, they stood back. Some say they didn't want to trigger the explosion too soon. Others say they were simply afraid. Then came the spark. One inmate was caught using a phone controlled by the other crew. He thought he could sneak in a quick call when the line was empty. But he forgot the golden rule. No phone is ever empty. Within seconds, the rival gang stormed the day room. Fists, elbows, makeshift blades. Chaos erupted. The guards? They locked the doors and waited. The block became a battlefield. Inmates screamed. Metal clanged against concrete, and blood stained the floor. By the time officers finally stormed in, the fight was over. One man lay unconscious. Another was dragged out with stab wounds. The gangs? They'd already retreated, regrouped, and reclaimed their corners. Officially, it was written up as inmate violence. Unofficially, everyone knew what it meant. The gangs were flexing. They were showing the entire block. And the guards, that they held the real authority. For the inmates caught in the middle, it was terrifying. For the gangs, it was business as usual. But here's the most chilling part. Even after the fight, the gangs agreed to cool things down. They decided when the violence ended, not the guards. And just like that, the block slipped back into a tense silence, with everyone pretending nothing had happened. It was a reminder to every soul inside Rikers Supermax. The Department of Correction might control the doors, but the gangs control life behind them. And in the shadows of that silence, another battle was already brewing. The Price of Defiance. In a place where gangs make the rules, what happens when someone dares to break them? There was one inmate, let's call him Marcus, who refused to bow down. He wasn't part of any crew. He'd grown up in Brooklyn, survived on the streets, and thought he could survive Rikers on his own. At first, the gangs left him alone. But soon, the pressure mounted. It started with food. One night, Marcus refused to give up his tray to a higher-ranking gang member. The other inmates stared in silence as he ate his meal, a quiet rebellion in a world where rebellion isn't allowed. The next day, his pillow was missing, then his shoes. A few nights later, His cell door jammed, just long enough for 3 masked men to rush inside. Marcus survived, but barely. The guards pulled him out bruised, battered, and bloodied. The official report called it an inmate altercation. But everyone knew what it really was: punishment. And yet, Marcus didn't fold. He refused to join a crew. He refused to pay tribute. He refused to follow the rules written in ink and tattooed in blood. For that, he became a symbol to some and a target to others. The gangs watched him closely. Some admired his defiance. Others wanted him silenced. Because in a place where gangs control everything, a man who stands alone is more dangerous than a weapon. One night, rumors spread to the block. Marcus had spoken out against a gang leader. No one knew if it was true, but the tension in the air was thick. Inmates whispered that the next day he wouldn't wake up, and that's the unspoken law of Rikers Supermax. You can break the prison's rules and maybe survive, but break the gang's rules, and your life is no longer your own. But Marcus's defiance wasn't just about survival. It exposed something bigger, something that made even the guards uneasy. Because if one man could stand against the gangs, what would happen if others followed? The hidden kingdom. To truly understand how gangs run Rikers Supermax, you have to look beyond the fights and punishments. Because what they've built isn't just a network, it's a kingdom. Every block has its hierarchy. At the top, the shot callers, the leaders who give the orders. Beneath them, the enforcers, men who carry out discipline, keep the phones locked down, and collect taxes from weaker inmates. At the bottom, the recruits, often young men who just arrived and need protection. This structure mirrors the outside world. In fact, many of these leaders have direct lines to their street crews. Orders flow both ways. An inmate in Rikers might be told to target someone in the block, while someone on the outside handles business for the gang's survival. It's a pipeline of control that blurs the line between jail and street. And here's the most unsettling part. Sometimes the guards rely on this system. If they need to keep a lid on violence, they'll quietly let the gang leaders know. If they need a specific inmate to behave, they'll let the crews handle it. On the surface, it looks like order, but underneath, it's an empire built on fear. Even mundane things, like who gets to clean the showers or who sleeps on which tier, become political decisions. Cross the wrong line, and you'll be punished. Follow the rules, and you'll be rewarded with scraps of freedom. Extra time on the phone, a safer bunk, maybe even a pass on a chore. For an inmate inside Rikers Supermax, it's a daily negotiation. Survival in exchange for submission. And yet, for all their power, the gangs know their control is fragile. One wrong move, one unexpected shift, and the kingdom could collapse. That's why, in the shadows, they're always preparing, always recruiting, always enforcing silence. Because in a place like Rikers, power doesn't stay still. It shifts, it grows, and sometimes it explodes. And soon, an explosion was coming, one that would change the balance of Rikers Supermax forever. The riot nobody stopped. It started like any other morning in Rikers Supermax. Breakfast trays clattered through the slot. Inmates shuffled to the day room. Guards leaned against the glass, sipping coffee, their eyes scanning but never too closely. On the surface, it looked like routine. But beneath the silence, something had been brewing for weeks. The Bloods and the Trinitarios had been locked in a cold war. Small fights, threats, stolen food trays, and whispers of betrayal. Everyone felt it. The air was heavy, like a storm waiting to break. And then, one morning, it did. A Trinitario recruit ignored the unspoken rule and walked into Blood territory to grab a seat at a table. A chair screeched against the floor. Heads turned. For a few seconds, the block froze. Then, like a spark to gasoline, chaos erupted. Tables flipped. Shanks flashed. Men leapt across the room, fists and blades cutting through the air. It wasn't one fight. It was dozens at once. The block exploded into a full-scale riot. The guards? They didn't rush in. They fell back. Some say they were waiting for backup. Others say they were simply too afraid. From behind the glass, they watched as inmates turned the day room into a battlefield. One man climbed onto a table, swinging a broken broom handle. Another was cornered, fists pounding until his head bounced off the concrete. Screams echoed through the block, metal clanged, bodies slammed into steel doors. Minutes felt like hours. By the time tactical units stormed in with shields and pepper spray, the damage was done. Inmates lay sprawled across the floor, some unconscious, others bloody but still alive. The official report called it a disturbance. But inside the block, everyone knew the truth. This wasn't just a fight. It was a riot, a message. The gangs weren't just making rules. They were willing to burn the block to prove them. And the most chilling part? The riot didn't end because the guards stopped it. It ended because the gang leaders decided it was over. From that day forward, every inmate knew the truth in their bones. The gangs ruled not just the phones, the food, or the beds. They ruled life itself inside Rikers Supermax. But after the riot, a new problem emerged, one that exposed just how dangerous the gang's grip had become. The Smuggled Crown. Every kingdom needs resources. And in Rikers Supermax, those resources come from one place: contraband. Phones, drugs, weapons, cigarettes, even extra food. Anything that isn't nailed down or bolted shut can become currency. And the gangs, they control it all. But how does contraband get into one of the most secure facilities in America? The truth is as shocking as it is simple. Some of it comes through visits, some through corrupt staff, some hidden inside deliveries. There's one infamous story about a guard who was caught sneaking in tobacco and cell phones for a powerful gang leader. He didn't do it because he was threatened. He did it because the gang paid him thousands of dollars for items worth a fraction on streets. Inside Rikers, those items turn into gold. With a smuggled phone, a gang leader could call the outside world, order hits, direct drug deals, or even control street-level crews while locked behind bars. In one case, investigators discovered that an entire narcotics ring in the Bronx was being coordinated from a single Riker cell. The gangs turned contraband into power. A cigarette could buy protection. A razor blade could buy loyalty. A phone could make a man untouchable. And the guards knew it. Some turned a blind eye. Others played along. Because in a place where survival is uncertain, even the staff found themselves caught in the gang's web. But contraband wasn't just about money. It was about the crown, the invisible crown that made gangs rulers inside the Supermax. Whoever controlled the contraband controlled the block. And when rival gangs fought over that crown, the block became a war zone all over again. But there was one more thing contraband brought into the prison, a weapon more dangerous than any blade or fist: information. And information was about to shake Rikers Supermax to its core. The Whisper Network. It's easy to think of gangs as just muscle and violence, but their real power lies in something far quieter: whispers. Inside Rikers Supermax, gangs don't just control resources. They control information. Who talks to whom? Who owes money? Who betrayed their crew on the outside? Every rumor, every secret, every move is tracked. There's an unspoken network that flows through the cells and day rooms, carried on scraps of paper, coded words, and whispered conversations. Guards might think they're in control, but half the time, the gangs know more about the block than the officers themselves. One chilling example. A new inmate was placed into a cell, believed to be just another face in the crowd. But within hours, the gangs knew he had testified in court against his old crew. His paperwork hadn't even arrived yet, but the Whisper Network had already marked him. That night, his cell door jammed. He didn't make it to breakfast the next morning. The report called it injuries from an altercation, but the inmates called it justice. This Whisper Network doesn't just track enemies, it spreads fear. Inmates who even think about cooperating with staff find themselves isolated, pressured, or worse. And for the guards, it means they're always one step behind. By the time they hear a rumor, the gangs have already acted on it. It's like fighting shadows. And this shadow system doesn't stop at the gates. Whispers travel out of Rikers, across the bridges, into the streets of New York. Crews on the outside respond to orders passed inside. Families are pressured. Rivals are hunted. The prison walls don't stop the whispers. They amplify them. So, when you combine violence, contraband, and whispers, what do you get? Not just a prison, not just a supermax, but a shadow kingdom ruled by gangs where survival isn't about following the law. It's about following the whispers. And soon, those whispers would ignite something even worse than a riot. Something that would force the world outside to pay attention. The silent lockdown. After the riot and the flood of contraband, the Department of Correction had no choice. They declared a lockdown. Doors slammed shut. Lights blared. Meals were pushed through slots. No yard, no phones, no movement. On paper, lockdowns are supposed to break control, to remind inmates that the jail still belongs to the state. But inside Rikers Supermax, it had the opposite effect. Because when men are locked inside tiny cells 23 hours a day, the gangs adapt. Messages are tapped out on walls in coded rhythms. Kites, tiny scraps of paper, slide under doors. Even guards carrying food become unwilling messengers. Pressure to pass notes from one leader to another. And the longer the lockdown went, the clearer it became. The gangs weren't losing power. They were tightening their grip. One officer later admitted, "We thought we were controlling them, but they were controlling us. They knew when the doors would open before we did." The most chilling part? When the lockdown finally ended, the block was calmer than before. Not because the state had restored order, but because the gang leaders had. It was a silent reminder. No matter what the department tried, the gangs were always one step ahead. But lockdowns only pressurize a system already ready to explode. And when the doors opened again, it was only a matter of time before the next eruption. The inside trial. In Rikers Supermax, justice doesn't only happen in courtrooms. It happens inside the blocks, where gangs hold their own trials. If an inmate is accused of breaking the rules, stealing, disrespecting, or snitching, the gang leaders decide his fate. They call it a meeting. But everyone knows it's a trial. Picture this. A circle of men in the day room, their eyes locked on one prisoner. No lawyers, no judge, just leaders and enforcers. The accused stands alone, sweating under the fluorescent lights, knowing his fate rests in their hands. The leaders question him. Did he disrespect the hierarchy? Did he lie? Did he steal food? In some cases, the trial lasts minutes. In others, hours. But the outcome is almost always the same. Guilty. The punishment? It varies. Sometimes it's a beating. Sometimes it's isolation. Sometimes the accused is forced to check in. Prison slang for requesting protective custody, which marks him forever as weak. And in the worst cases, he disappears from the block, carried out on a stretcher. The guards? They know these trials happen. They see the groups gathering. But stepping in means risking another riot. So they let it happen. One inmate described it best. In Rikers, the gangs don't just run the block. They run the court. They run the law. They decide if you live with respect or live in fear. And for the men trapped inside, that law carries more weight than any gavel in New York City. But as these inside trials grew harsher, whispers began spreading. Whispers of something bigger. Something even the gangs couldn't fully control. The breaking point. By now, the gangs weren't just running the Supermax. They were running it openly. Phones, food, punishment, justice, everything flowed through them. And the guards? They were shadows in their own prison. But then came the breaking point. A young recruit, barely 17, refused to join a crew. He wanted to serve his time quietly, without getting involved. But in Rikers Supermax, that's impossible. He was approached again and again, offers of protection, demands for loyalty. And each time he said no. The gang saw his defiance as disrespect. They warned him, choose a side or we'll choose for you. He still refused. One night, during recreation, he was cornered. The guards watched from behind the glass as the leaders stepped forward. They didn't touch him. They didn't need to. Instead, they gave the signal. Dozens of eyes turned. The block fell silent. Then, like a wave, fists crashed down on the boy. He crumpled under the weight of men twice his size. Guards shouted. Alarms blared. But no one moved to stop it. By the time officers stormed the block, it was too late. The boy was unconscious, carried out on a stretcher, his fate unknown. The gangs had made their point. And the message was clear. In Rikers Supermax, refusing to follow the rules isn't bravery. It's suicide. That night, whispers spread to the cells. Some inmates were horrified. Others were inspired. Because for the first time, the balance was teetering. The gangs were stronger than ever. But their control had pushed the block to its breaking point. And when a system breaks in Rikers, the explosion doesn't just stay inside the walls. It spills into the city beyond. The day the guards lost the block. It was supposed to be a normal evening in Rikers Supermax. The lights dimmed. The cells closed. Officers settled into their stations. But behind the bars, something unusual was happening. The gangs had united. Normally, rival crews fought each other for control. But that night, whispers spread of a temporary truce. Bloods, Crips, Trinitarios, and Kings each agreed to set aside their rivalry for one reason: to show the guards who really ran the block. It started small. Inmates refused to lock in. Doors clanged, voices rose, fists pounded against steel. When officers ordered compliance, the block roared back in unison. No! Then came the coordinated chaos. Trash cans lit on fire. Sheets hung over railings like banners of rebellion. Phones ripped from the walls and smashed. It wasn't a riot between gangs. It was gangs versus the system itself. The guards? They froze. Outnumbered. Outshouted. For a terrifying hour, the Supermax was no longer theirs. It belonged to the inmates. Only when tactical teams stormed in with shields, pepper spray, and batons did the rebellion collapse. Inmates dropped to the ground, coughing, choking, blinded by chemicals. Order was restored, or so it seemed, but every man inside knew the truth. That night, the gangs had proven something chilling. When they choose to unite, not even the state can stop them, and the fear of that power lingered long after the fires were put out. The echo beyond the walls. Rikers Supermax doesn't exist in isolation. The gangs inside are connected to the streets outside, and every time control slips within the walls, those echoes ripple into New York City. Phones smuggled in during visits. Orders whispered out to street crews. Retaliations planned from cells. The walls of Rikers don't just hold men, they amplify their reach. One investigation uncovered that shootings in the Bronx had been directly ordered from inside Rikers. A single gang leader, locked in solitary, had used a smuggled phone to direct violence miles away. Another case revealed that drug shipments across Harlem were being tracked, measured, and divided from behind bars. The city thought Rikers was a cage, but in reality it was a command center. And this raised a terrifying question. If gangs could control life inside the Supermax and still control the streets beyond, then who truly had the power? The state or the men behind the bars? The more investigators dug, the clearer the answer became. Rikers wasn't just housing gang leaders. It was feeding them. And every fight, every riot, every whisper only made their power grow stronger. The crown without a king. Every kingdom eventually reaches a breaking point. And for Rikers Supermax, that moment came when one of the most powerful gang leaders inside was suddenly removed, transferred out in the dead of night. No warning, no explanation, just gone. At first, the block held its breath. Some believed peace might follow. Without a king, maybe the kingdom would crumble. But instead, the opposite happened. The removal sparked chaos. Rival leaders fought for control. Alliances shattered. The fragile balance dissolved overnight. For weeks, the Supermax shook with violence. Stabbings, beatings, lockdowns, and nonstop tension. The guards tried to restore order, but it was like patching a sinking ship. Every time they quelled one fight, another erupted. Inmates began saying the block was cursed, that without a true leader, the gangs would rip each other and the prison apart. It was a perfect symbol of Rikers Island itself. A place built to hold chaos, but destined to collapse under it. And as the smoke cleared, one undeniable truth remained. The Kingdom of Fear, Rikers Island Supermax, was designed to be a fortress, a place where the most dangerous men in New York could be locked away, controlled, and contained. But instead, it became something else. A kingdom where gangs make the rules, where punishment isn't handed down by judges, but by men with tattoos and shanks, where phones and whispers carry more power than steel doors and uniforms. For decades, the state has tried to break that kingdom, through lockdowns, through transfers, through walls of concrete and barbed wire. And yet, the gangs remain, adapting, growing, waiting. Because the truth is simple. In Rikers Supermax, survival doesn't belong to the strongest officer or the sharpest lawyer or even the system itself. It belongs to the gangs. And as long as men keep arriving on that island, as long as fear continues to rule the tiers, the crown of Rikers Supermax will never be empty. It will always rest on the heads of those willing to seize it. Because here, gangs don't just survive the rules. They make them.